Welcome to the forum. I'm Charles Royer, Director of the Institute of Politics, and I would like to begin by just welcoming you to a new semester where we'll have lots of activities such as this in the forum, and we hope you all come back. I should recognize also that there are a number of new freshmen at Harvard College here in the front rows. Welcome to all of you. You should know that you won't always get to sit in the front row. This time is special. This is a special event because every year in May, on the President's birthday, on or about President Kennedy's birthday on the 29th, we celebrate his commitment to public service and his life in public service. This year, because of the untimely death of Mrs. Onassis, we postponed the event, an event that commemorates the anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Law. 32 years ago, in 1962, a young man named James Meredith was trying to get into the University of Mississippi, and a young man named Edward M. Kennedy was trying to get in the Senate. They both did. And Senator Kennedy is here tonight to open our program with some reflections on civil rights over this 32-year period of his leadership in the Senate on this issue, and the 30th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I must say that nobody knows this really, but Senator Kennedy makes an enormous contribution to this school and the Institute with a gift of time that very few people know or understand. His contact with students, his interest in the curriculum and in the activities that go on here, preparing people for careers in public service, is really, I think, one of the things that certainly distinguishes him, in my mind, among the political leaders we see in our country today. So it's with a lot of pleasure that I ask you to welcome the Honorable Senator Edward M. Kennedy, the senior senator of Massachusetts.
Thank you very much, Charlie. That's okay. Thank you, Charlie. Very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Charlie Royer. I want to thank Charlie for his kind words. Okay. Thank Charlie for his... What a way to start the school year off. I'm under no illusion of why you're all here. I'm glad he's here too. I'm just glad I was on the same flyer with him. Let me thank all of you for being here and saying what a real pleasure it is for me to be here. Just very briefly, I have a great and strong and enduring commitment about the Institute of Politics. President Kennedy attended Harvard at some time during his life here at this great university. Something struck a spark in him about public life, public concern, public office, and I think elective office. And this institute, with all its varied programs, tries to reach out to the student body and offer perhaps an opportunity for young people that come here who have a wide and diverse interest, and before coming here, and perhaps they too, through some channel, also will take an interest in the public life of our country, and that is really its purpose and why this Institute of Politics is the living memorial to the President, my brother, and why it means so much to all of us. An outstanding panel that will be introduced in just a few moments. Let me just say why I think it's appropriate that we have this forum here, and also here really in Massachusetts. When I first began my political life, there were young people from Boston that were going down and sitting in the lunch counters in Georgia. They were the real leaders in the lunch counter demonstrations, and later they were the ones that marched with Martin Luther King. The stirrings of the 1958 Civil Rights Act, and I remember my brother voting for the Title III of that Civil Rights Act, which was really the controversial title of that legislation, but still it was a legislation not to deal with the overarching failure of the Founding Fathers who inscribed slavery into the Constitution of the United States. Our Founding Fathers failed on that issue. and the Civil War failed to really resolve that question. Important legislation passed subsequently, but we as a society never really began to deal with it until Martin Luther King really led the way. Awakened the conscience of the nation in the late 1950s and awakened a president's heart and soul and mind in the early 1960s, and we'll hear more about that from the 1960s up till the present time. I would just make a brief comment, and that is that the march in terms of striking down the barriers of discrimination are really the defining issue for our country, for our society, and what this nation is really all about. If we fail on that, this country will never be America. It's a painful and difficult process, and obviously we can't just deal with it from a legislative point of view. It has to be the change in the hearts and souls of the people of this country. But we can make sure from a legislative point of view that we can, to the best of our ability, eliminate those barriers of discrimination. And we took those initial steps in 1964, again in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We failed in the Housing Act in 1968. But nonetheless, the drumbeats of eliminating discrimination worked in other ways. In 1965, we eliminated the national origin quota system in our immigration laws that discriminated against people coming into the United States on the basis of where they were born. We eliminated the Asian Pacific Triangle in the immigration laws that discriminated against Asians, limited them to only 125 individuals coming into the United States. The whole drumbeat had started during that period of time. And as we have seen that drumbeat on discrimination on the basis of race, we've seen it extended in terms of national origin. We've seen it extended in terms of religion. We've seen it extended in the most recent times on the issues of gender. Not completely. We still have to take the measure on the Equal Rights Amendment, which still limits women's recovery for judgment on sexual harassment in ways that we do not permit discrimination against others in our society. But we have made progress in the areas of gender. And in the recent years, we made that progress in the areas of the disability movement. And in the most prominent time before the United States Congress and Senate is the issue of whether we're going to eliminate discrimination against gay and lesbians. That is the whole kind of a sequence. It really started, I believe, on the basis of all that come from different perspectives, all that have different historical developments, all of which have arrived and come to a confluence of events in our society. But there is no question in my mind, as a legislator, that the real impetus, the real movement, the whole way that we have begun to deal with these kinds goes back to the late 1950s, the early 1960s, on what this country decided to do, what it sometimes does, and what it should do when it's at its best, and that is to fight against the stain of discrimination in whatever form, in whatever shape that it comes. And with that kind of a leadership, I believe what President Kennedy did, sure, there are examples of what more could be done, but taking the principled stand on those issues at the early time really opened up with so many other leaders in the federal district courts and the Fifth Circuit, proud Republicans that follow a tradition of republicanism that dates back to the time of Lincoln, a proud tradition which has not emerged in recent form in that shape that we would have liked to have seen in many of the battles that we have faced. But nonetheless, it has been this society, this country, with leadership, both in the judiciary, at the local level, at the street level, at the church level, and primarily a tribute to the work of Dr. Martin Luther King. I look forward to hearing the panel this evening. Thank you.
I want to thank my uncle for that introduction. It's always tough to follow Teddy. One of the great fringe benefits on being on the board of the IOP is that once a year I'm able to sit up here with such a distinguished group of panelists and moderate them, even if I do sit on the side and introduce them and then watch the words fly. But I'm glad you were all able to join us here today. We're going to begin with a film, which is a compilation of archival footage from the library. And I'd like to thank James Hill and Alan Goodrich at the JFK Library for putting together the film. And I'd also like to thank Robert Drew for providing us with his extraordinary film clips of the President in the Oval Office dealing with the crisis at the University of Alabama. Just to note, I think what's interesting about the film is President Kennedy's transition from a press conference given in May of 1962 in which he offered a rather formal and legalistic justification for federal intervention in enforcing integration. And then to a later speech given in June of 1963, which was the date of the first black student registration at the University of Alabama, in which he gives a passionate appeal to the American people for racial equality as a moral imperative. The film is 14 minutes long, and I think that maybe some folks on the side will not be able to see it all. So if you do want to, well, there's not a lot of room, but if you do want to try to squeeze, it's worth seeing, but the words speak for themselves. So.
Today, during this presidential campaign, there is one outstanding moral issue: civil rights.
I think that the failure of the president to indicate his endorsement of the Supreme Court decision has cost us heavily. I hope the next president of the United States states that he stands for equal rights, that he stands for a fair chance for all Americans to have a decent education, to get a job, and to hold it.
Vote for the candidate who cares. John F. Kennedy for president.
Dr. Martin Luther King said yesterday that you could do more in the area of moral persuasion by occasionally speaking out against segregation and counseling the nation on the moral aspects of this problem. Would you comment on this, sir?
I made it very clear that I'm for every American citizen having his constitutional rights, and the United States government under this administration has taken a whole variety of very effective steps to improve the equal opportunities for all Americans, and will continue to do so.
James H. Meredith is formally enrolled at the University of Mississippi, ending one chapter in the federal government's efforts to desegregate the university. The town of Oxford is an armed camp, following riots that accompany the registration of the first Negro in the university's 118-year history.
Americans are free, in short, to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it. For any government of laws and not of men, no man, however prominent or powerful, and no mob, however unruly or boisterous, is entitled to defy a court of law. Even though this government had not originally been a party to the case, my responsibility as president was therefore inescapable. I accept it. My obligation under the Constitution and the statutes of the United States was and is to implement the orders of the court with whatever means are necessary and with as little force and civil disorder as the circumstances permit. It was for this reason that I federalized the Mississippi National Guard as the most appropriate instrument, should any be needed, to preserve law and order while United States Marshals carried out the orders of the court and prepared to back them up with whatever other civil or military enforcement might have been required. I deeply regret the fact that any action by the executive branch was necessary in this case, but all other avenues and alternatives, including persuasion and conciliation, had been tried and exhausted. Had the police powers of Mississippi been used to support the orders of the court instead of deliberately and unlawfully blocking them, had the University of Mississippi fulfilled its standard of excellence by quietly admitting this applicant in conformity with what so many other southern state universities have done for so many years, a peaceable and sensible solution would have been possible without any federal intervention.
On the matter of improving race relations in the United States, do you think a fireside chat on civil rights would serve a constructive purpose?
Well, it might. If I thought it would, I would give one. We have attempted to use all. What happens is we move situation by situation, and quite obviously that's, and all these situations carry with them dangers. We have not got a settlement yet in Birmingham. I've attempted to make clear my strong view that there is a important moral issue involved of equality for all of our citizens, and that until you give it to them, they're going to have difficulties as we've had this week in Birmingham. The time to give it to them is before the disasters come and not afterwards. But I made a speech the night of Mississippi at Oxford to the citizens of Mississippi and others. It did not seem to do much good, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep trying.
He knows that for one man to defy a law or court order he does not like is to invite others to defy those which they do not like, leading to a breakdown of all justice and all order. He knows, too, that every fellow man is entitled to be regarded with decency and treated with dignity. Any educated citizen who seeks to subvert the law, to suppress freedom, or to subject other human beings to acts that are less than human degrades his inheritance, ignores his learning, and betrays his obligations. Certain other societies may respect the rule of force. We respect the rule of law.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Of course, he called up to God. It seems to me we might try to tie it to the fact that he continues to say that he's called up to God, which indicates that he thinks the situation is very critical. After all, he called up to God. I didn't. A, to do the situation, which is necessitated you calling up 600 God. I'm therefore, to meet my response, be prepared for any situation, because if you are, we are going to federalize this God, and so on and so forth. Now, he may announce that in that case he won't be responsible for law and order, but that could come any day. That's the matter. Then we would have the God ready, and then we would use...
then I suppose to say that you would hope that none of this would be necessary, that he would stay at home, and in your judgment, that if he does stay at home, the local police department and the authorities of the university...
It might possibly avoid this problem of arrest.
Disadvantages of your calling of the guard. All right, now, say, I'm going to have to wait for 24 hours.
Let me just call time.
So I would think that probably, unless we change, probably the best thing to do would be to go as scheduled. Just put up with the 24 hours, but we would be nationalizing the God in that period. We could make a speech on television, take other actions to indicate that we are not permitting him to get away with the crime, and it's inevitable that we're going to be successful.
The University of Alabama campus at Tuscaloosa is under a tight security guard of state police as Governor George Wallace appeals for calm and prepares to confront a deputy U.S. attorney. The federal officers are armed with a proclamation from President Kennedy urging the governor to end his efforts to prevent 2 Negro students from registering at the university. The governor is adamant. He made a campaign promise to stand in the doorway himself to prevent the integration of the last all-white state university. Brigadier General Henry Graham arrives to tell the governor, "It's my sad duty to ask you to step aside on orders of the President of the United States." The governor yields to federal authority, but promises to continue what he terms a constitutional fight.
I hope that every American, regardless of where he lives, will stop and examine his conscience about this and other related incidents. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish his children to be treated. This is not even a legal or legislative issue alone. It is better to settle these matters in the courts than on the streets, and new laws are needed at every level. But law alone cannot make men see right. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free, except for the Negroes? That we have no second-class citizens, except Negroes? That we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes? Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is a time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in all of our daily lives.
We'll proceed. Each panelist will have an opportunity to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and then at the conclusion of that, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions on the 2 microphones here. Our first speaker is seated to my left, John Siegenthaler. He is currently the chair and founder of the Freedom Forum First Amendment Center at Vanderbilt University and the chair emeritus of the Tennessean, Nashville's morning newspaper, where he's worked for 43 years as a reporter, editor, publisher, and CEO. He is also the founding editorial director of USA Today. He started his career as a journalist in 1949 and left journalism in the 1960s to work in the Justice Department as an assistant to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, where he focused on civil rights, judicial selection, and organized crime. In the 1961 Freedom Rides, he was President Kennedy's chief negotiator with Governor George Wallace of Alabama, and during that crisis was attacked by a mob and hospitalized. He's here today to share his experiences on the civil rights movement of the 1960s and offer his perspectives on the issue today.
Thanks very much, John. As some of you will learn in the next 5 minutes, I am Southern. Usually when Senator Kennedy comes to Tennessee, I translate for him. He didn't volunteer to translate for me today. I don't really think he ever understands much of what I say. It's good to be here at Harvard. I was a Nieman Fellow here in 1958, the time when John Kennedy was running for re-election to the Senate. During that period, I had an opportunity to travel with that campaign and interact with him and with some of those on his staff whom I had known earlier in Washington. At that time, it was no secret that that campaign was sort of a springboard for one that would come 2 years later. And I made up my mind during that period here at Harvard that if I had the opportunity, I would join his campaign, and so I did in 1960 and worked in Washington for him, and then went into the Justice Department for Robert Kennedy as his administrative assistant immediately after the campaign. I thought it might be helpful if I spent just a few minutes in some ways setting the scene that the Civil Rights Movement faced and that the Justice Department faced during those trying and sometimes tragic years you just witnessed on the screen. I was raised in a South that was as segregated in my youth and as segregated in that period as Johannesburg, South Africa, the worst time of apartheid. It was a period in which, in every aspect of life, African Americans were treated as second-class citizens. The crisis of 1958, while I was here and while Senator Kennedy was running for re-election to the Senate, exploded in Little Rock, Arkansas, where there was an effort to integrate, by federal court's order, Central High School. That resulted in President Eisenhower calling out troops, enforcing the orders of the court, and it was a matter of months that the American military establishment was located in the city of Little Rock to bring about that change. When we came to the Justice Department and when the administration was faced with the reality of enforcing the law, it was in the context that on the books in many places in the South, Jim Crow laws were still recognized and still enforced, despite the fact that some of the signs were coming down and some access, some minimal access, was being permitted. It was a time. I remember the president made a speech during that period to a group of newspaper publishers, and he said to them what a sad thing it was that black soldiers fighting in Vietnam who lost their lives came home. Their families traveled to Arlington to be buried and were unable along the way to find a place to sleep, a place to eat, a place to go to the bathroom. Segregation was still so pervasive in that time. The role of the Justice Department was somewhat handicapped because at that time the view of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was that civil rights was basically outside its purview. And so we had very little opportunity to use a federal police establishment to investigate or enforce the law. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, held to the idea that his jurisdiction and the FBI's jurisdiction was limited to about 6 areas: bank robbery, kidnapping, interstate transportation of automobiles, interstate transportation of women for immoral purposes, treason, and I guess kidnapping. He had about a dozen agents who were interested in peripheral subjects of civil rights. And one of the great controversies between the director of the FBI and the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, was over the effort to require him to, as the civil rights movement under the leadership of Dr. King and the other groups, CORE and SNCC, as that movement began to gain momentum, there was a conflict in an effort to get him to move agents, hundreds of agents in the area of internal security, into the field of civil rights. Mr. Hoover maintained that Congress had not given him jurisdiction, nor was he funded to perform what was required of him by the Attorney General. He was, under the law, the subordinate of the Attorney General. Still, he resisted that, and it led to great difficulty between the two of them personally and between the leadership of the Justice Department and the willingness of the FBI to perform. If you look at Mississippi Burning, some of the docudramas that have been produced in recent years, you find there, as you find in much of the literature, a sort of revisionist history. It was not that way at all. In the South, where the law was enforced by local police officers, you found quite often that those charged with enforcing the law were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Many times had participated in violence against the blacks. Many times had engaged themselves or protected those who were involved in lynch law. And so it was a very difficult and dangerous time for those who were involved in the civil rights movement, those who were on the streets. It was a very frustrating time for those of us who sought to provide some help and support for them. The Attorney General's view was that it would be best if we were able to resolve the issue in the courts, not in the streets. But of course the civil rights movement was in the streets. As Dr. King and those in the movement said so and demonstrated so eloquently, nobody's going to turn us around. And the movement had momentum, and young people came from all over the country and were part of that movement, and there was violence, and there was bloodshed, and there was trauma, and there was terror, and there was an effort to enforce the law. But so often the FBI agents who were on the local scene had been there for a long time, and they had been working with local police officers, Klansmen, in many cases. They had been working with them to solve bank robberies and white slavery cases and interstate transportation of automobiles and kidnapping. There wasn't much treason around that you could prosecute in those days, but those were the conditions in which the violence occurred. Those were the conditions that led to the death of many of those leaders who were in that movement. The death of Medgar Edgars, the death of Cheney and Schwerner and Goodman in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and many, many more were maimed, and many, many others were thrown into jail. Gradually, Mr. Hoover, because national conscience was raised, and the national guilt forced action, and Congress began to change its attitude gradually under pressure from the administration and under pressure from Congress. Mr. Hoover began to respond, and agents did begin to move in and were reassigned and did quite often act in a forceful way to investigate. Too often it was an investigation of civil rights violations that had already occurred. I suppose the first crisis for the administration was the Freedom Rides. They began in Baltimore and in Anniston, Alabama on Sunday afternoon. Disaster struck. They were beaten and bloodied. A second wave came to their rescue, and they were beaten and bloodied. And still the movement sent hundreds into the South to fill the jails and to continue to sing the anthem, "We Shall Overcome," and the spirituals, and recite, "Nobody gonna turn us around. Ain't nobody gonna turn us around." And nobody was gonna turn them around. And so during that period, the Justice Department began to build up and reinforce its legal commitment inside the Civil Rights Division. The day I came into the Justice Department, there were only 6 lawyers, 3 of them, one of whom held Duval Patrick's job, and 2 assistants, and 3 other lawyers. By the time I left, 2.5 years later, there were 15, and we thought that had been great progress we had made, but of course it was totally an inadequate force. The crisis in the civil rights, the crisis of the Freedom Rides was resolved because the administration decided for the first time that it had to respond with force, and it sent in marshals. It sent in marshals to bring about peace. Dr. King was surrounded by a mob in a church one Friday night after the Freedom Rides had occurred. His life was in danger. The lives of those in the church were in danger. There was a very tough exchange between him and the Attorney General that night. The marshals and the state police finally came in, and violence was averted that evening. The next great crisis was Ole Miss. General Edwin Walker, created on his own a riot there that night. Marshals came in and tried to hold the peace. They were shot down on the campus, and at that point the National Guard was called in, and military troops were called in. And then you saw the third great crisis, which was the University of Alabama, in which Governor Wallace sought to defy the federal order. Truth of the matter is, with all that defiance, it was really a moment of surrender. When you saw Nick Katzenbach walk up and George Wallace walk away, it was an act of surrender, and no matter who was from where watching that, the most diehard, unreconstructed Southern Confederate rebel knew that the beginning of the end was when George Wallace turned his back and walked away. I think I'll stop there. I think that sets the scene and says where we were in the Kennedy administration during that crucial period. Duval and I spoke last night. It's a much more complex civil rights division today, and the duties and obligations and responsibilities and challenges are much greater and much more diverse today. The theme then, I think, justice on the law for that department and for that division. It was a difficult one to assert, but it was asserted with a great deal of vigor by the Attorney General and by the President with support from the White House. I think I'll leave it there.
Skip Gates is a familiar figure on the Harvard campus, where he is a professor of English and a chairman of the Du Bois Institute and the Department of Afro-American Studies. He is, as Time magazine says, quote, one of the nation's most influential intellectuals. He's written extensively for many publications and is the author of several books most recently Colored People, which is about his coming of age in a small segregated town of Piedmont, West Virginia, during one of America's most tumultuous eras.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me okay? Recently, as you just heard, I published a memoir of black life in the 1950s and 1960s, and it's called Colored People. Now, much of it concerns the civil rights era and its impact upon us in our very tiny village called Piedmont, located in the hills of West Virginia, about 2 hours west of Washington, D.C. Now, I've agreed to read a brief excerpt from this memoir, which refers to President Kennedy's speech of September 30, 1962, an excerpt of which we just heard, the speech that confirmed James Meredith's right to attend the University of Mississippi, a speech that I watched live with my father, who is now 81 years old and who is sitting in the front row of the auditorium today. Civil rights took us all by surprise. Every night we'd wait until the news to see what Dr. King and them were doing. It was like watching the Olympics or the World Series when somebody colored was on. The murder of Emmett Till was one of my first memories. He had whistled at some white girl, they said. That's all he had done. He was beat so bad they didn't even want to open the casket, but his mama made them open it. She wanted the world to see what they had done to her baby. In 1957, when I was in the second grade, black children integrated Central High in Little Rock. We watched it on TV. All of us watched it on TV. I don't mean just Mama and Daddy and Rocky. I mean all the colored people in America watched it on TV together with one set of eyes. We'd watch it in the morning on the Today Show on NBC before we'd go to school. We'd watch it in the evening on the news with Edward R. Murrow on CBS. We'd watch the special bulletins at night, interrupting our TV shows. Those children were all well scrubbed and greased down, as we used to say. Hair short and closely cropped, parted and oiled, that is the boys, done in a permanent and straightened with turned up bangs and curls, the girls. Starched shirts, white and creased pants, shoes shining like a buck private's spit shine. I'm telling you, those Negroes were clean. The children would get off their school bus surrounded by soldiers from the National Guard and a whole field of state police. They would stop at the steps of the bus and seem to take a very deep breath. Then the phalanx would start to move slowly along this gully of sidewalk and rednecks that connected the steps of the school bus with the white wooden double doors of the school. All kinds of crackers would be lining that gully, separated from the phalanx of children by rows and rows of state police who formed a barrier arm in arm. Cheerleaders from the all-white high school that was desperately trying to stay that way were dressed in those funny little pleated skirts with a big red C standing for Central on their chests. And they'd wave their pom-poms and start to cheer, 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate. And all those crackers and all those rednecks would join in that chant as if their very lives depended on it. Deafening it was. Even on our 12-inch TV, a 3-inch speaker buried along the back of its left side, the sound was deafening. The TV was the ritual arena for the drama of race. In our family, it was located in the living room where it functioned like a fireplace in the proverbial New England winter. I'd sit in the water in the galvanized tub in the middle of our kitchen, watching the TV in the next room while Mama did the laundry or some other chore as she waited for Daddy to come home from his second job. We watched people getting hosed and cracked over their heads, people being spat upon and arrested, rednecks sicking fierce dogs on women and children, our people responding by singing and marching and staying strong, eyes on the prize, eyes on the prize. George Wallace at the gate of the University of Alabama trying to block Arthurine Lucy's way. Charlene Hunter at the University of Georgia. President Kennedy interrupting our scheduled program with a special address saying that James Meredith will definitely enter the University of Mississippi, and saying it like he believed it, unlike Eisenhower. Saying it like the big kids said, it's our turn to play on the basketball court, and walking all through us little kids as if we weren't even there. Whatever tumult our small screen revealed, though, the dawn of the civil rights era could be no more than a spectator sport in Piedmont, West Virginia. It was almost like a war being fought overseas. And all things considered, white and colored Piedmont got along pretty well in those years, the 50s and early 60s, at least as long as colored people didn't try to sit down in the cut-rate drugstore or at the Rendezvous bar, or eat pizza at Eddie's, or buy property, or move into the white neighborhoods, or dance with, date, or dilate upon white people. not to mention try to get a job in the craft unions at the paper mill, or have a drink at the white VFW, or join the white American Legion, or get loans at the bank, or just generally get out of line. Other than that, colored and white got on pretty well in Piedmont, West Virginia. What is remarkable to me here today, 32 years later, is both that we recall so many details of President Kennedy's speech about James Meredith, and that it resonates to this very day. For in this speech, the President found both a language and a rhetoric, for the first time in our history, I believe, to express in the most forceful terms the determination of the executive branch of the American government to enforce the tenets of Brown v. Board. In doing so, and in making such visible and stellar appointments as Carl Rowan and Clifford Alexander, among others, to his staff, and by including and honoring outstanding black artists at the White House, President Kennedy became the very first American president to articulate the place of the Negro as one central to the very fabric of the Republic rather than peripheral to it. And more than that, in his person, that is, in his manner, in his bearing, in his ease, comfort, and generosity of spirit, in the presence, the intimate presence of black people. In all these ways, philosophically as well as politically, symbolically as well as literally, President Kennedy's administration signaled the arrival of the African American at center stage in American domestic policy, and indeed at center stage in the social and political life of this country. Thank you very much.
Judith Lichtman has been a leader in the women's and civil rights movements for more than 3 decades. She's been president of the Women's Legal Defense Fund for 20 years, and in that position has played a key role in several pieces of federal legislation, including the passage of the 1978 Pregnancy Discrimination Act, the 1991 Civil Rights Restoration Act, and the 1993 Family and Medical Leave Act. She's worked for decades to end sex discrimination, sexual harassment, and wage discrimination. Increasingly, we're reminded that civil rights encompasses not only racial but gender discrimination as well. We look forward to hearing her perspectives on this increasingly topical issue. Judith.
Thank you. You know, I have so much to say to all of you that I'm having trouble figuring out how to focus my remarks. It would be quite easy to focus all 7 minutes, if I'm hoggy about my time, to talking about the women's perspective, and I will indeed devote some of my time to that. But I cannot resist talking about what it was like to be what I would have called 30 years ago a white liberal. Probably today I would call myself a white progressive. I don't think there's much of a distinction. In the heart of the civil rights movement. I went to law school, which was a pretty gutsy thing to do in 1962. There were only 2 of us at the University of Wisconsin in my class of 150 in a state law school, because I wanted to work on civil rights issues. I didn't have any of the crisis of conscience that law students had then and now about whether or not to go into corporate practice. I thought that civil rights was the area in which my activist degree in law could be the most useful. And it is in that regard that I truly believe that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was an employment act for me. I couldn't imagine anything more fabulous graduating in 1965 than going out to implement this brand new act, and that's what I did. I went to work first for what has now become the Office of Civil Rights in now the Department of Education. It then didn't have a name, and it was in the Department of HEW. And I ran around the South as a young, white, Jewish woman telling Southern school superintendents what they had to do in 66 and 67 to comply with Title VI of the 64 Civil Rights Act. You can just imagine how well received I was. There were times when, those were the times when in integrated groups, it would not have occurred to us to eat in the white community. It would not have occurred to us to stay at anywhere but these brand new hotels called Holiday Inns that were beginning to show up in certain big cities in the South. I spent lots of time in Oxford in 66 and 67 telling the Oxford School District what it had to do to desegregate. And for some perspective, I want to tell you, it was to put 2, we would have said, Negro children in the school. Not 2 per class, not 2 per grade, but 2 blacks per school. And then we spent every evening going around to black churches with black community leaders trying to convince black parents that indeed this was a good idea. And you won't be surprised to learn that lots of them knew better than we did about how courageous an act it really would have been. I could spend a lot more time talking about black issues of the 60s. I did not have a feminist conscience until the early 70s, so I won't pretend I did. In 1964, in the Civil Rights Act, there was really only one provision that protected women against gender bias, and that's the employment section, Title VII. And many of you may know that the prohibition against sex discrimination was added partly as a joke and partly as a way of showing those wide-eyed liberals just how ridiculous and how out of hand the Civil Rights Act had really become. Because in the litany of protected classes against discrimination, a white Southerner from Virginia in the Congress added the letters S-E-X to the litany of prohibitions against race, color, national origin, and religion. And the purpose for Congressman Smith doing so was to show everybody just how crazy this nation had truly become. A wonderful woman who was then in the Congress, Martha Griffiths, a representative then from Michigan, didn't think it was so nuts and made a rather unholy alliance with some of these conservative members, and indeed the sex discrimination prohibition stuck. We are not included in any of the other provisions or any of the titles that prohibit discrimination in public accommodations or indeed in programs that receive federal financial assistance. The Title VI prohibition against discrimination that I talked about in the school desegregation context. Let me spend a minute or two telling you what was legal in '64. You could fire a woman for being pregnant, and indeed there were many schools that thought it was quote unquote unseemly for women who showed, there's an expression you haven't heard in a while, to be in front of a classroom with children. And so women who were pregnant when they showed were routinely fired. It was legal to fire women who had children of school age. And indeed, Mrs. Phillips, I think it was not until 1968, sued the Martin Marietta Corporation because the corporation wanted to fire her because she had school-aged children. And it'll be interesting for you to know the tie between race discrimination and sex discrimination was so complete that where did Mrs. Phillips go? She too was a Southerner, John. She went to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And later, Elaine Jones, who is now the council president but was then a young staff lawyer, asked Mrs. Phillips, what made you, the Southern white woman, come to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund? And she said, I thought you all knew something about discrimination. Indeed, what we then called the Inc. Fund, the Legal Defense Fund, brought that case and was ultimately successful on Mrs. Phillips' behalf, and the Title VII provision took on some new life. Finally, by way of example, newspapers were replete with ads, want ads for jobs that said men, and women. And it was very clear that if you were a woman, you sure as hell weren't going to apply for a men-wanted job, and of course, vice versa. I think the quick morality tale for me is both how far we've come when I watch these tapes that aren't really part of our history, but part of our lives, those things we lived through. I have a wonderful poster in my living room that's a MFDP poster, a Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party poster, given to me by Fannie Lou Hamer when my husband and I got married in 1967. And a young law student said to me, "What's that?" And I told her about Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and I told her about the 64 challenge by the group that was integrated in Mississippi and could not be seated by the Democratic Party, and the ultimate seating in 68. And she said, "Oh, I remember, I read that in history." And I was so offended. I said, "That's not history, that was my life." I was boggled by the notion that that was history. But also how far we have to go. I think if the 12 years, and I say this really not in as partisan a way as I fear it will sound, but if I think of the 12 years of Reagan and Bush, I think of how fragile the gains of the 60s and early 70s were, and how we had to hold on in court case after court case where the Justice Department and that Civil Rights Division was no longer on our side, but had in many instances switched sides. So they were with the defendants opposing civil rights. I think of the civil rights struggle as an ongoing struggle, and one in which I hope we engage all of you, because fighting for all of our rights isn't something somebody else does, and it isn't something that you do once and walk away from. I thank you.
Deval Patrick is the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the United States Department of Justice. The Civil Rights Division is the agency of the federal government primarily responsible for enforcing federal statutes and executive orders that prohibit unlawful discrimination. Mr. Patrick grew up on the south side of Chicago, and from there he received a scholarship to Milton Academy and went on to receive his undergraduate and law degrees from Harvard University. After completing a Court of Appeals clerkship, Mr. Patrick joined the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund in New York as a staff attorney. After several years at the Boston law firm of Hill and Barlow, Mr. Patrick was appointed this past spring to his current position at the Justice Department by President Clinton. He brings a unique perspective to this discussion as one both affected by and now affecting the civil rights movement in America today.
John, thank you very much. I want to be personal, as some of the other panelists have been, about the civil rights movement, because as John indicated, I wasn't so much in the civil rights movement as of the civil rights movement. Judith, you understand that I'm not picking on you when I say that when you graduated from high school, from law school, I was 8. And my first encounter, that's all right, and she's still good. My first encounter with the 60s civil rights movement was during the Chicago garbage workers strike. Some of you will remember. And my mother took my sister and I, who was, I think at the time 9, out to a park in southwest Chicago to listen to Dr. King, who had come to Chicago to talk to us. And I don't remember what he was talking about, but I very vividly remember that it was a solemn occasion. I very vividly remember how it felt. And I remember more than anything the tremendous sense of hope that we had in that park together. Nothing so much that was said, even even among those of us in my family, just a sense of hope and promise. And I have come over the years to value that sense of hope above almost anything else. I learned then and have been learning since, as I say, living the civil rights movement and then doing civil rights work, what a strong sense of what's possible in America. I talked about this when I was confirmed, or when I was at my hearing to be confirmed. The sense that we have been evolving over decades now toward our national ideals, and most importantly, that we have a moral obligation to try to evolve toward our national ideals. I think it's also important, wonderful as this program is, that we take care not to let civil rights at any time be driven by nostalgia. The civil rights movement is as vivid and as prescient and as essential and critical today as it ever was. And we have to, it seems to me, be as determined and as courageous as some of the people you saw on that tape earlier, and many, many others who were not on that tape but that you've heard about referred to. There are lots and lots of young people today, many of whom are here in the freshman class convocation near the front of the room, who were never touched by the civil rights movement, who don't have a personal connection and a personal memory about what that was like and what it was about and why it was so essential. And it seems to me that it's incumbent upon all of us to lay claim to their conscience as well, and to help you see the connection between the civil rights movement in its broadest and most noble sense and our national ideals. And if I can do one thing that is worthy in the job I have the opportunity to serve in now, it will be to make some contribution to that. Thanks very much.
We're going to open up the discussion to questions now. As I said, there's microphones on either side. I would ask only that you keep your questions and to the point, as we would like to give as many folks as possible an opportunity to ask them. I would also encourage the panel to freely chime in as you wish, regardless of who the question is asked to. So I see there's also, if you're a little cramped over there, there's a microphone over there, but first question.
Thank you. My name is Avery Gardner. I'm a sophomore at the college and a member of the Institute's Student Advisory Committee. This summer we've heard a lot about the NAACP in the news, unfortunately in quite a negative light. There's been a lot of internal turmoil, and we heard a lot about people losing confidence in the organization, about corporations and the American public losing their confidence in the NAACP. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the immediate future of the organization and what change it may have to take in influencing civil rights legislation and policy in the future.
I'll start. I think that what we saw this summer was the fact that the NAACP specifically, and I think the civil rights movement generally, has an identity crisis. And it has an identity crisis because we have simultaneously and paradoxically in this country the largest black middle class in our history and the largest black underclass. And very few of our theories of civil rights predicted this outcome, the outcome of all that successful legislation and agitation which we've been talking about for the last hour. And I think that learning how gender and class compound with racial discrimination is the task of our generation of political leaders and academics, and I don't think that we've been very good about that. And until we do, until we understand how racism affects some members of the black community in ways different than other members of the black community, for example, I don't think we'll be able to shape a real agenda for the 1990s and the 21st century.
You want more? Well, I actually think the NAACP is stronger than you read about. I deal with a lot of the people who are involved in local chapters, with rank and file members, with their representatives in Washington, and I think the NAACP is in very good hands indeed. I think the NAACP, like every other civil rights organization, is having to determine just exactly what its role is in the context in which it's operating, and we are all operating just as Skip as Professor Gates has indicated. And I think the NAACP has expressed that it's the master of its own destiny by making the changes that it did.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dave Bonfile. I'm also an undergraduate here at the university and a member of the Student Advisory Committee. My question concerns a program that grew out of the civil rights movement of the 60s called A Better Chance, or ABC. The ABC program was initiated to facilitate minority students from underprivileged families attending what were then called the white establishment prep schools, elite prep schools like Milton and St. Paul's and Exeter and so on.
For example.
Since the 60s, the ABC program and others like it have suffered a number of cutbacks that have caused them to reduce their scope and to shift, in many cases, their target audience from underprivileged families to more readily accessible middle-class families. My question, and this is in particular directed to Mr. Patrick, concerns the impact and effectiveness of these programs, whether there is still a need for them today, if so, whether they've lost their focus, and if that's because of these funding cutbacks, whether there is a potential for reversing these shifts.
Well, David, I was an ABC student, and I went to Milton Academy, and it was about as foreign an experience as I can remember. In fact, I remember when I got there, having grown up on the south side of Chicago, and there's a road called Center Street in Milton, and you drive up toward the campus, and I remember thinking I'd never seen so much privately owned lawn before. Before I went to Milton Academy, well, when I got there, in those days, in the 9th grade, you had alcoves, they were called. They were rooms with walls that didn't go all the way up to the ceiling, and curtains for doors, and everybody got one in the 9th grade. I had come there from a 2-bedroom apartment where we lived with my grandparents, and I shared a room with my mother and sister, and we rotated every third. We had bunk beds. We rotated every third night on the floor. So I thought this alcove was pretty cool. So first, I think that over the years, as I have sorted out that experience, and I have worked with Milton Academy as a trustee and with other schools, public and private, we have wondered whether, in fact, we were bringing children from places like my neighborhood there to break their hearts, because it was so foreign and so difficult. And that was a time, I think, quite unlike today, when schools like Milton Academy were not very good at making children of color feel as if their own backgrounds were valued. It was, now that has changed in, I think, material respects at that school and others. ABC, I think, still has a role and is still trying to still making it possible for kids to see a sense of possibility and horizon that was different from where some of us came from and the kind of surroundings that some of us were in. But like a lot of good things, it's not the only answer. The fact that ABC doesn't work in some respects, in some particular circumstances, doesn't mean it's a bad program. Nor does it mean that that the solution to the problems of of children in hopeless situations in urban areas is to deliver them all to places where there's an enormous amount of privately owned lawn. It's one of a number of ways up, and I think it's important. It's been important for me in the little ways I've done it, and important for others who do find a way up to reach back, and that's a part of our tradition that I've tried to live by.
Hi, my name is Christopher Garcia, and I'm a senior at the college. As we've heard this evening, the civil rights movement of the 60s was one very much for integration. Today, however, some sectors of minority communities, particularly the African American community, are so frustrated that there is, in some sense, a call for segregation. I was wondering how that call and the frustration that has led to that call informs the civil rights debate today for you.
For me?
All of you. If you
Anybody
want.
else? I'm doing all the talking.
You know, I find myself answering many questions like that with another question, as opposed to what? What recourse do we have as a nation but integration? Is it apartheid? The apartheid that was very real in Piedmont 30 years ago and probably very real a lot less than 30 years ago? I am enormously patriotic and a believer in this great democracy, understanding to my core its great flaws and faults. And I think if we are to keep this democracy as great as it could be, because it sure ain't there yet, we can't turn our backs on living with people, judging people because of who they are and what they can accomplish, rather than their gender or their disability or their color of their skin. I can't imagine what the alternative is to treating other human beings as human beings.
I, of course, relate to everything that Judy says, because I put an awful lot of struggle and a lot of effort and a lot of emotional energy and some footprints into bringing about change. On the other hand, as I look today at historically black colleges and universities and find there numbers of students who simply aren't comfortable and assert that they will not perform as well in an integrated environment, I understand where they're coming from and why they are where they are. The important thing for me, and I'm sure Judy would agree with this, is the opportunity for the choice. I think if our society continues to work toward the sort of beloved community that Martin Luther King sought, then the powerful magnet of opportunity that'll be part of that will work toward an integrated society. But from my perspective, if that opportunity is there and some choose, for whatever reason, to remain separate, it hurts me, but I understand, I think.
I think that as well, in my capacity as chair of a department, I'm an official of the university. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us who are officials of this university and any other great university to distinguish between, on the one hand, the right of students to associate willingly through whatever organizing rubric they might want to use, and on the other hand, to stand against enforced segregation. Students have the right to join Hillel. Students have the right to join the Catholic Student Organization. Students have the right to join the Black Student Association, et cetera, et cetera. But, I mean, I'm always disturbed by certain forms of self-segregation among our students. For example, every day when I walk in, every time, I don't go there every day, when I walk into the freshman union and I see all those students sitting together, all those white students sitting together, it really bothers me. But you see, we don't think about the irony that you know, it only occurs to us when we see Hispanic students sitting together, Asian students sitting together, black students sitting together. But if you're a person of color, it looks like all these white people are clinging to each other. You know, it's how you tilt your head at the picture. And, but I also understand the frustrations of the failure of democracy, the failures of socioeconomic integration in this country, which lead to an enormous amount of rage. Rage which demagogues can give voice to. And we can't dismiss that sense of rage, a legitimate sense of rage, by dismissing demagogues who give voice to that rage. And until we address the economic problems in this country, the problems of distribution of means, I think that the kind of segregation that you're alluding to is only going to increase.
I think it's all been said, but I would add just this, that you should not be mistaken in believing that the view or the inclination toward resegregation or any other opinion is the monolithic opinion of the entire African American community. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Heidi Erickson, and I'm a senior. Dio Valenti will graduate. I'm not sure when, but I have a question specifically for Mr. Patrick. Having been a little bit older student, having some experience in the medical field, I studied medical research for about 7 years at various places, including the University of Chicago. So South Side of Chicago is very familiar to me. It's a very interesting experience, especially if you experience the community going down the L instead of the IC.
Right.
But one of also my jobs this last year was studying in the legal aspect of rehabilitation. And I had the opportunity to call your office and ask about how the procedures went in the disability area, the ADA, the new law that passed a couple of years ago, and your office is now forcefully investigating investigating those aspects. And I had the opportunity to talk to one of your attorneys, and he had said that you're so overwhelmed with a lot of this new issues on this ADA that they were investigating maybe 1% of all of the inquiries to your office. And I was just wondering if you could maybe address what your future aspects on that would be.
On the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Yes, I
can try. The Americans with Disabilities Act, for those who don't know, and you probably all do, is legislation passed in 1990 that extends civil rights protections, particularly public access and employment-related kinds of protections to citizens with disabilities. We have the responsibility for enforcing that act under the delegation of duty in the Department of Justice. And to be perfectly frank, until this spring, relatively little had been done to enforce that, enforce the act. We receive several tens of thousands of ADA-related complaints. It is much, much more than we can possibly handle, even with not 14 but 250 lawyers in the division, with about a dozen and a half other statutes to enforce. And what we have done is determine two things: that we should and must concentrate on one or two aspects of the ADA so that we can develop the law in a broad and sensible way, the statute being so new, and then we can leverage out the enforcement by involving the United States attorneys and, frankly, the state's attorneys as well. I had a meeting today with the National Association of Attorneys General, whose civil rights components were meeting here in Boston, and we talked about that kind of thing, and we've begun to involve the United States attorneys' offices as well. We won't ever really be able to do all that there is to do, whether it's ADA or anything else, for that matter. But we are trying now to make strategic choices about the areas of emphasis. It's a part of a strategic plan we're doing in the whole division, which should be announced within the next few weeks.
Is one of those plans possibly grassroots direction? Yep. Since it's, can you elaborate just a little?
Well, in fact, there are a number of disability rights groups. Some of the most active are actually out on the West Coast, who are active in ADA litigation. There are private causes of action under the ADA, so the enforcement responsibility doesn't rest entirely with the Department of Justice. And we're very much in touch with them in developing what our strategic plan should be.
Good luck. Thank you.
I'm getting the big sign from the side, so I'm afraid we just have time for one more question.
Oh, okay. My name is Jeff Rapp.
Well, actually, we have two. We'll be fair. We'll say
All right.
we got two more. If you can just keep them.
You just saved
I'll
his
keep it
life.
brief. My name is Jeff Rapp. I'm from Honolulu, and I've been a freshman at the college for about 3 days. And after watching the film and listening to your comments, it's obvious how instrumental the leadership of President Kennedy was in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. My question is, and I appreciate a response from anyone who wants to provide one, do we have the kind of leadership today for which we need to overcome the hurdles that remain?
It's a good question. Who's first?
I'll try my hand first, and I'll try to give a quick answer. I think with respect to the president, we do, and I'll give you two quick anecdotes. 2 days after the Clinton inaugural, I found myself in the White House, a place I hadn't been in 12 years, for the signing of 4 Senator Mikulski said that day there were more women there that day than had been there in 12 years. Now, if you clap, I won't be fast. 2 days after the inaugural, the Friday of the Wednesday of that week, where the president signed 4 executive orders with respect to women's reproductive health. 1, overturning the Mexico City policy. 2, allowing research on RU 486. 3, overturning the gag rule. And 4, I'm going to forget what. Oh, research, fetal tissue research. 2 weeks later, to the day, I found myself in the Rose Garden, a place I couldn't get to today because a plane crashed in the Rose Garden, where the president signed family and medical leave, a law that I had led an effort on, and I say this humbly, not bragging, for 8 years. 8 years, not able to overcome 2 presidential vetoes. From my vantage point, I have some leadership. My other quick anecdote is a race context. It was the anniversary of Martin Luther King's birthday. It was January 18th. You probably had as bad an ice storm here or wherever you were as we had in Washington. And I went to the White House. The president that day returned from Russia. You may remember that day. You may remember that his mom had just died days before. And there was a conclave honoring Martin Luther King's birthday, where I saw black ministers and members of SNCC and CORE that I hadn't seen in 25 and 30 years. Now, I would have expected black ministers from Arkansas. That was a sort of political thing that I could get. There were people from rural Mississippi and rural Alabama and rural Georgia, all of whom knew the President of the United States. They knew him a lot better than I did. Somewhere along the line in campaigning for whatever office that man had campaigned for, he had touched the hearts of grassroots African-American rural America. And a great many white and African-American and Hispanic civil rights leaders on that awful, awful night came out. There are 2 quick anecdotes, but, you know, is everything perfect? No. That's why we need all of you to work very hard.
I just add one quick word. It does seem to me that the complexity of oppressed people today is far more pervasive. General Patrick's division with 10 separate sections illustrates that. But it does seem to me, Judy said, that we have a president today, among all the candidates who ran in the last election, who at least understands that there still are people who are denied human rights and civil rights, and who has tried to assert those, the opportunity for those people to have those rights. And I would certainly include his effort on behalf of women to provide the most diverse cabinet and the most diverse administration in history. He knows that the military position on gays is an outrage against the rights of homosexuals, and he made an effort in that direction and accepted a compromise. And let me just say, there were times when President Kennedy and every president since has known that dealing with racist or sexist or anti-Semitic or homophobic members of Congress or members of the electorate presents very difficult times, and there are times when you must compromise. I think the answer, I would agree with Judy that he is up to it.
Thank you.
First of all, Mr. Kennedy, I'd like to thank you for allowing one last question, as will my parents and grandparents when I call them to tell them about my first big activity here at Harvard. My name is here at Harvard. However, in the last few days, student, a fresh person, fresh folk, frosh, etc. And so my question lies in the area of political correctness. Now, when we saw the on was President Kennedy, obviously a man of his times, in which the mentality was slightly different. All men are created men to discriminate against other men, etc. So my question is, how important is the political correctness war in the grand scheme of things? Obviously, there are some words, and ethnic slurs, etc., that are obviously out. Carefully, do we have to watch our words, or is it actions that truly matter more?
That's another great question. I think political correctness is meaningless. Respect is very meaningful. You know, like I do, that there are words that cut, and you have to think about what you say and the impact of what you say, because the impact of what you say can sometimes be as powerful as the actions themselves. That does not mean that we have to censor ourselves, censor the natural or vigorous debate on any of these issues. But these issues are only going to be debated constructively if we do it in a respectful tone, it seems to me.
Well, I can't resist another quick story. In January of '68, my husband argued a very important then Voting Rights Act case, the first in what was then the Fifth Circuit, in front of a panel of all the judges of the Fifth Circuit. It was a big day in Houston. And a lot of civil rights cases were being argued, public accommodations, the closing of amusement parks, Voting Rights Act cases, and William Kunstler was arguing for CORE that day, and he kept talking about black people. It was early January '68, and he said black people about 10 times, and finally, a judge that Senator Kennedy talked about today, a great Republican judge, Judge Minor Wisdom, leaned forward and said, "Mr. Kunstler, what is this new word? I've always heard Negro, and now you're talking about black." And Kunstler went into a discussion about what happens to Negro and how it becomes Negra. And he talked about the importance of using the word black, and Wisdom sort of shook his head. And hours later, my husband's argument was the very last of this very long day of civil rights cases, the Attorney General of the state of Mississippi kept saying, "Negra, Negra," and then he slipped, and he said it. He said "nigger." And Judge Wisdom leaned forward so vigorously that his glasses fell off. He had to catch them, and he said, "That is contumacious behavior in this court, and you are guilty of contempt." Later, delivered to us by the Attorney General of the state of Mississippi. There it was, language
for the evening. I want to thank our group of panelists. Joining us also. We'll see you next